My name's Rosy Tellez, and as you know, I was here with you about a month ago, and I will be sharing with you today about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Oftentimes, I think we miss out on opportunities because we're not really sure about what this all means. What is the ADA? Some of us do know, some of us may not be so clear on what the ADA is all about. I'll be sharing this with you in the next minute, and feel free to hold your questions to the end. We will be having a session to answer your questions. Again, I'm here with the Disability Rights California. It's the largest nonprofit law firm in the nation, and we're here in California. So it's great because we are to provide education and advocate for our peers who are Californians with disabilities, and that really covers a whole gamut of the whole range of different types of disabilities. I happen to work in the unit where all of our individuals that work in this particular unit, we identify as individuals with a mental health disability. Okay. So the way it works, when people first call our agency, they get taken into this, what we call an intake. So people will take your general information about what your question is, or if you want more clarification, or what's a particular issue you're dealing with, they'll send you to the right representative. Now, if it's something that our agency can help you with, they'll refer you to another agency. Now, we do have materials on our website, and they're available in various languages and also in alternative formats. Now, we do provide these legal trainings, counsel, and advice. That would be from our legal unit. There's a different unit that does the public policy. So if there's a group of people and a pool of people that are interested in making change systematically, there's representation that can take place on that end. Now, we do have advocates at the 5 different state hospitals in California, and we have clients' rights advocates at the regional centers, and that would be for our clients. Although some of these advocates, their office would be inside the regional center, our advocates do not work for the regional center. They're there to protect your rights. Now, the representation of individuals with disabilities would be depending on the area in which our agency is focused and doing this legal representation. Okay. And again, like I mentioned, I'm with the Peer Self-Advocacy Unit, so we're here to teach our peers on what they need to know and understand how to navigate for you to advocate for yourself. Okay. Now, there's a disclaimer I have to share with you that this is not legal advice. And so I just shared with you regarding our program and that kind of thing. And I'm going to the disclaimer that this is not legal advice yet. It's just a presentation from our peer perspective. Thanks for that, Judy. That way you can follow along with what I'm sharing right on time for our presentation overview. So I will be talking to you about a little bit about the history of the ADA. Some of you might have not been born yet when this all came about, but it certainly was a great moment in time where it kind of set the path for us to benefit from all those rights we now have. So what is the Americans with Disabilities Act? What kind of rights do we have? And what are the 5 titles of this ADA? So there's 5 different titles I'll be sharing with you about. You don't have to remember all of this. I'll just tell you some key points as we're going along on what to remember, okay? So what are reasonable accommodations? I'll be sharing that with you too, since that's what's allowed me to be able to work for the amount of time that I have. So a little bit of history here. I'll take you back in time in the 1960s. So this whole movement about disability rights came about the time where the civil rights movement was happening, and also the women's rights movement was happening. I'm sure you've heard about that. So there was a lot of our pioneer peers who really established what we know to be the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and that was back in 1973 when it became law. Okay, but they had been working on it since the 1960s. All right. I'll go here. Now, this act of 1973 had a few things that had gaps in it. So let me share that with you. In the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, It states that no qualified individual with a disability in the U.S. shall be excluded from, denied the benefit of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. You see that? Federal financial assistance, but you're not talking about the private sector, which onto the ADA, on the passing of the ADA, it says here, it says, not until the passage of the ADA did the law address those areas that were not covered by the 504. So it was to benefit that this all happened in 1990. So I have a picture here on the screen. This image has, at the time, was President George Bush. He was signing into law the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this took place in 1990. Now, it was in the South Lawn of the White House. A lot of wonderful advocates who've been doing a lot of tireless work. They had been advocating, remember, since the 1960s, and this is 1990 when it was finally being signed into law. Evan Camp, he was a chairperson for Equal Employment Opportunity Commission at the time. That would be the person in the far left there. And then you see President George H.W. Bush signing the law. And to the right, the gentleman with the hat, that would be Justin Dart, Chairman, President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities. He's quite an advocate, really advocated for equality throughout the United States. Now, standing behind you, will see Reverend Harold Wilk and Swift Perino, Chairperson of the National Council on Disability. She has a couple of children, well, at the time they were children with disabilities. I wouldn't know the age groups at this point. And one of the quotes that I can remember clearly from President was, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." You guys are welcome to look on YouTube for the live video of when he was presenting this into law. Now, the beauty of it is we have opportunity to take advantage, to have access to various things and locations. And I'll share some of the changes as I go along in this presentation. So, in essence, what is this Americans with Disabilities Act? Well, the ADA is a federal civil rights law that passed in the 1990. The law prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. This is a key point, in all areas of public life. Okay? Now, these areas of public life are protected under the ADA. That would be employment, school, transportation, telecommunications, all public and private places open to the general public. And I might be giving you some scenarios as we go along. Now, the civil rights protections for individuals with disabilities, remember, everything that relates to public access, to the general public. Now, the purpose of this American with Disabilities Act, I'll just refer to it as ADA moving forward, okay? So the purpose of the ADA is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. We're talking about that equality, right? So who's protected under the ADA? According to the law, and let me give you this little warning, the law's language at the time may be a little bit dated, and it's not what we refer to it today, okay? So as I read the law, I'll let you know. An individual with a disability is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits major life activities, now has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such impairment. I'm going to explain that a little bit to you, because oftentimes we may have a disability and they have a period of time where we're doing well, and then we may have this disability again, or it's something that impacts us periodically or continuously. So it's considered to be regarded as having this disability. I'll give you some examples as it comes in the PowerPoint. Now, this is where I was talking about the disclaimer on the language, and this is coming from the law, okay, how it's written. So it says physical or mental impairments include, but are not limited to, visual, speech, and hearing impairments, as they refer to it. Now, this is where I was saying, right? Mental retardation. Now we know it to, and we refer to it as individuals with cognitive disabilities. Now, emotional illness and specific learning disabilities. Here's a few by title: cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and muscular dystrophy. There's more. It also makes reference to multiple sclerosis, orthopedic conditions, in fact, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and contagious and non-contagious diseases. Now, this might be news to some of you. As it relates to the ADA, also individuals that are diagnosed with tuberculosis and HIV diseases, whether the condition is symptomatic or asymptomatic. That means if it's causing active, if it's actively impacting an individual's life, or the symptoms have subsided and they're still able to carry on with life, that doesn't mean that later on there might be a period or an episode in time where it will impact their day-to-day activities, right? So they're protected. As you may know, individuals that may have the diabetes, if the blood is either too high or too low, it impacts people's day-to-day activities. So these individuals are also protected. Now, you also might have heard cancer. Individuals that, you know, I happen to be a cancer survivor. I have a lot of loved ones who are currently fighting the cancer and others who have passed. And I can tell you that they didn't know that the cancer diagnosis is protected under the ADA. Remember, it could be whether the symptoms are active or they're on remission, and they're regarded as having this disability. So there are some keywords there that we can keep in mind. If it's something that's not going to help us, we can certainly share the info for someone else too. So under the ADA, there's some quote unquote, right? Qualified persons with a disability. This would be individuals who meet essential eligibility requirements for receipt of services or participation in programs or activities. As you know, there's a lot of programs that are designed for specific groups, for particular disabilities, because that's their area of expertise. They may have resources, they know treatment, they know a lot of other options to best treat people depending on disabilities, right? So whether a particular condition constitutes a disability within the meaning of ADA, it's case-by-case determination. Now, I think it's important to note too and share with you that the term disability, it's not the same across the board. So say, for instance, under the ADA, disability is regarded as a certain thing. Then if we're going to qualify for benefits and apply for Social Security Administration, they have their own definition of disability. Now, there's individuals that may go to the Department of Public Social Services to apply for benefits. They have their own definition of disability. So the term of disability, the definition of disability, it's different depending on where we're going to go and get services. So that's a little tricky sometimes. I just thought I'd share that tip with you. So now, what do we have a right to as people with disabilities? Well, we have the right to what we called, and it's known out there as a reasonable accommodation. So we have the right to equal access in different areas of life. What does that mean? They can't put the red lights, as I have the picture on the screen, right? A little board kind of covering the road and blocking the road. Well, none of that. We have access to various areas of life under the term of reasonable accommodation. Now, I'm going to share with you how sometimes people may say, well, that's what they call another keyword, undue hardship. I'll share with that in just a sec. So now this reasonable accommodation refers to a couple of different things, and I'm going to break this down for you. It means accessible common spaces. Remember what we shared in the beginning, all the public areas, people where if there's access for everyone to be standing or going or rolling by a place, that means that location, that particular area has to be accessible. I'm giving you examples here. It would be such as meeting rooms, right? There has to be ample room for people to move around in. There has to be possibly a ramp for individuals to have access to it, and other accommodations. Also a restaurant. There are restrooms, possibly the parking lot should have an accessible parking stall. Then doctor office lobbies, because it's an open area, they ought to have it available and accessible to individuals with different type of disabilities because it's a general open space. Fitness centers. We don't think of as fitness centers to be a location or a business that would have to be accessible, and in fact, they are. Some restrictions with that, though, that I find that some of our peers have shared regarding accessibility. Say, for instance, some fitness centers may not have, say, like where people do certain exercises that would be accessible, say, for instance, for our peers who may use a wheelchair, or other equipment. They can make it accessible by possibly lowering, or they have the staff kind of adjusting certain equipment to make it accessible for people, which is a great thing. They get the benefit of using the fitness center. How about examples of accommodation will also include a wheelchair ramp to access buildings, such as at a store or the post office or a bank. Now, accessible information would also refer to large print. Some of our peers may be of the low vision community, so they may need to have large print printed. Nowadays with COVID, right, everything has pretty much gone electronic. So it has to be in a format that people may have, like possible screen readers, and they can be able to listen to what is in writing and print. They'll be able to have it available to where it's audio. Or on video, right, for another area of accessibility, some videos also have a requirement to have closed captioning. I tend to use that a lot because oftentimes I may not understand what is being said. There's days where I have a little bit of a hard time hearing. So the closed captioning helps me be able to read what the conversation is. So it could be pretty accessible for some people. Now here we have it, the 5 titles of the ADA. I'm going to break these down. So just so you know, it just means that people have the rights in various areas such as employment, public services, public accommodations, telecommunications, and there's a part there that I also call it miscellaneous, but it has a little bit more information about transportation. Okay? So what are our rights when it refers to employment? Well, it helps people with disabilities access the same employment opportunities and benefits available to people without disabilities. It applies to employers with 15 or more employees. I always get this question, why 15? Why not 4? Why not 3? Why not 2 employees? Well, they have to make that comparison and that balance of, are they able, these other 15 people able to do their job without accommodations? Or are they some accommodations that could be made that we would be laboring as the same as someone without a disability? Remember, we all have different abilities, qualities, and skills. So that's the reason why they have set, this is a federal number that they have set is 15. Some states have less. They could say, okay, under such, say like FEHA, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, to say, okay, you ought to have, say, 5 people that are employees, so you compare it to those 5 people. If I'm someone with a disability, am I able to do my job the same as these 5 people with the accommodation? Okay, so it requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to quiet applicants or employees. Meaning, I'm an individual with a disability, I can request a reasonable accommodation, I'm going to talk to you how, in order for me to do my job just like the rest of my coworkers. Okay, so now it defines disability and it establishes these guidelines for reasonable accommodation process, and it addresses medical examinations and inquiries. I'm gonna get into that in a minute. When we request a reasonable accommodation, it would be required that you submit also a medical letter stating that you're able to do your job if this reasonable accommodation will be provided to you. I'm going to share a little bit more about that a little later. So the doctor will not disclose your diagnosis or your condition. They're only to describe, yes, Rosy's able to do her job if you provide this reasonable accommodation due to her disability. So they won't go into details. They'll go into details about what reasonable accommodation will work for me in order for me to do my job. I think that really relieves the pressure on a lot of people because we don't want our employers, if we decide to disclose our disability, to be knowing what it is. Some people decide not to. Other people just like, yeah, I want to tell them because I want to make sure that they know that I know my rights and I know what their responsibilities are in order for them to provide me this reasonable accommodation so I can do my job and not be able to work. I'm going to get into all those details a little later, okay? Now, with this employment opportunity, the reasonable accommodation is a change that accommodates employees with disabilities so that we can do our job without causing the employer what they call an undue hardship. That just means too much of a difficulty or an expense. But let me tell you, the employer has to explore ideas along with you, because if we're the ones that are interested in working, we know what works for us, right? We're the self-advocate. So we're going to advocate because we want this job. And we've been living with our condition as long as your age is. So we're the experts on what works for you, right? So we can tell them, look, okay, I can understand if this particular option is a bit much. How about this other option? And we're going to talk about some options in a little bit. So just remember, sometimes the employers might come back and say, okay, I cannot provide a reasonable accommodation because it's an undue hardship. Now, they're not off the hook yet. We have to also explore with the employer what will work, some alternatives, okay? So we got to know ourselves well. Now, accommodations include, listen to this, it could include a part-time or a modified work schedule. I know I talk to my peers and oftentimes they're like, you know, Rosy, mornings just don't work for me. Or I do best in the afternoons. Maybe I can get a part-time afternoon job. So you know yourself best, depending on how well we manage our wellness, right? Our well-being. Now, adjusting or modifying training materials or policies. Oftentimes the employers will have certain policies in place, but they're maybe willing to adjust them a little bit or modify some of their training materials, meaning if everything used to be in hard copies, nowadays they might consider doing a lot of things via email and electronic, right? Instead of doing in-person meetings, it might be more open to doing virtual meetings. So I know that a lot of things are changing with this whole COVID as it relates to employment. They're open to a lot of more alternatives now. So now providing readers and interpreters for some of our peers who need them, right? I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about employment a little later, where also a job coach can be considered an accommodation, okay? Title II. How about public services? Well, this Title II, the rights prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability by public entities such as state and local government agencies. What does that mean? That means anything, any business, any government, state or local agency cannot discriminate against us based on our disability. Now, it requires that they make their programs and services and activities accessible to individuals like ourselves, right? So they would have to modify and adjust their programs to best suit what we're looking for, how they can best serve us. Now here under Public 2 will continue. It said it outlines the requirements for self-evaluation and planning. They have to evaluate their programs and evaluate their services to make sure that they're accessible to us, okay? This is so that they make sure, and it's necessary to avoid any discrimination through any type of policy, a practice, a procedure, physical accessibility, such as the architectural barriers. I tell you, I've been to certain places and oftentimes they may not have a ramp or their restrooms are not accessible. They're so small, like the restroom, you can't even, you know, as a person standing, I can't even turn around. They're so tight and tiny, and they may not have an accessible restroom. So that would be considered an architectural barrier, right? What about the effective communication with people with hearing, vision, and speech disabilities? How many times have we been to places and they're like, no, we don't have anybody here that knows how to communicate via ASL? That hurts me. I'm like, we're in this moment in time, 2020. We have to modify. Okay, can we use technology to be able to communicate, right? To eliminate a barrier of communication. Also with hearing, oftentimes certain places may not have a phone number for TTY. They should, right? Or have email. You know, if you want to contact us, they'll have access to it via email. That's a form of making it accessible for individuals to be able to communicate. So again, I know technology has gone a long way since this law was written back in 1990. So Title III talks about public accommodations. Now, this prohibits places of public accommodations from discriminating against us. Now, what do these locations look like when we're talking about public accommodations? Well, it'll be privately owned, leased, or operated facilities like hotels, right? They oftentimes have a lot of accessible features. They have the disabled parking available. They have, you know, the ramps may be available for the hotel, the restrooms, the rooms, the restaurant, right? The retail places might be all accessible for individuals to access. Hotels, restaurants, retail merchants, the doctor's offices, right? Golf courses, private schools, some daycare centers, health clubs, sports stadiums, and movie theaters. So we see a lot of accessibility features being available at movie theaters, right? Not only the accessible um, auditorium there, some of the seats and the areas. Also, they will provide headsets for some individuals. And if need be, I see too how they have the closed caption in the bottom of the movie. So those are all accessible for accommodations for individuals. Now here it continues on buildings and structures. It says the minimum standards for accessibility for alterations and new construction of commercial facilities, meaning if there's a building that has a step and people are unable to access it, they would need to alter it, right? They would need to build maybe a concrete ramp or something that would be removable. Now, let me ask you a question. How many of us have been to the supermarket and we see these slates that are outside the door of the supermarket right before you get onto the parking lot and you're trying to walk out with your cart, right? Or helping a loved one with their cart, and then everything's bouncing, right? That particular bubble slate, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it, although a good friend of mine told me the name and I keep forgetting what it's called. But that is to make sure, and that is for our peers and and my friends who happen to be of the blind and low vision community, if they're using their white cane to be able to glide and be able to, you know, walk around, if they feel these bubbles on the ground, it lets them know they're coming onto oncoming traffic. So it actually has a purpose. These yellow, or oftentimes they're different colors, or they're you know, just like they'll match the ground. But if you see these type of bubble slates outside the supermarkets or any commercial store, those are to protect our peers and let them know you're coming onto oncoming traffic. And again, that's also something to make sure that it's accessible and for their safety, but that's also for people with disabilities. It's to, so now again, I'll get back to the presentation. It also requires public accommodations to remove barriers in existing buildings where it is easy to do so without much difficulty or expense. Let me give you an example. Oftentimes you go to some stores and to be able to access the door is so heavy, and people that have limited mobility may not be able to access that particular department store because the door is too heavy to pull. So what I've seen lately, a lot of modifications, they have the button for accessibility. You just press the button and it opens automatically. I don't know if you've been able to notice that in some of the buildings. So now, public accommodation and reasonable modification. So now some businesses, we have the right for people to make these reasonable modifications to the way that they usually do business when serving people with disabilities. So it requires these businesses to take steps necessary to communicate with us effectively. So whether it's for individuals that have a vision, a hearing, or speech disability. And I can give you some examples on those a little later. Let me get through this. Telecommunications. Now, telecommunications, this right requires that the telephone and internet companies provide nationwide system of interstate, meaning state to state, or intrastate, within the state, to communications relay services that allow individuals with hearing and speech disabilities to communicate over the telephone. Now, again, we have technology that's been put in place now that there's other state telephones available for individuals that need certain services to be available to them via the telecommunications programs in the state. Now, it also requires closed captioning for federal funded public service announcements. Oftentimes now you see that even the televisions, we have the ability to change that we want CC, right? The closed captioning. So it's the law, they gotta provide it. And it's for accessibility. Now, remember I mentioned Title V and Miscellaneous for transportation. Now, public transportation offered by a state or local government is covered under the Title II of the ADA. Publicly funded transportation includes, but is not limited to, like the bus, the passenger train, or the rail services. And these includes like the subways or light rail and, say, for instance, the Amtrak. They ought to be accessible. Now, if transportation is offered by a private company, it is covered by Title III. Now, these privately funded transportation include but are not limited to, like, say, some of the taxi cabs. They ought to be accessible. Oftentimes you see the minivans and they have the ramp that comes out, or it slides out and then the individual is able to roll onto them. Now, the airport shuttles, right? I've seen how in the back they have an accessible port in the back for individuals to have access to this shuttle and be able to be transported. Now, the intercity bus companies, in fact, the Greyhound and hotel provided transportation. These shuttles also ought to have a vehicle that could transport individuals and make it accessible to access one location to the other. I have a couple of things I want to go back and share with you about the ADA. When I was sharing about some of the modifications, I'll go back on my slides here to, say, for instance, employment. When I was talking about part-time and modified work schedules, there's so many other accommodations that a job can do. Oftentimes, if we need, certain accommodations would be, for instance, me, if I get easily distracted, which I do, I may request a quieter cubicle or a sitting location away from everyone else, like away from, like, say, the common area, or a walkway, or the hallway. Another thing too that they can do is allow you to have more like close supervised supervision meetings with your supervisor. That's another accommodation that we can request for, just so we can know that we are on top of our assignments. Okay, that's an accommodation. Say, supervisor, I like to see once you get the job and all that you want to meet with your supervisor, like, say, once a week, have a little check-in. When I was talking about public entities and some of the accessibilities, some of their programs, remember I mentioned, may not be accessible. Well, it might be because they may need staff that might be familiar with how to make things accessible to individuals with disabilities. Oftentimes, I find that we have to educate or find these teachable moments to tell people, This works for me, and I understand you're able, under your program or service, to make it accessible for people with disabilities like myself. It's the law under ADA. A lot of people get a little bit like timid or like, oh no, they said the keyword ADA, now I have to comply. It's a great way to make people do their job. Now, when we're talking about policies and procedures and make things accessible, oftentimes there's people that may be renting, right? And if somebody's renting from a building or a landlord, reasonable modifications may mean, yeah, we may need to put on a portable ramp. Or in the restroom, we may need a modification, possibly, you know, when we're getting a little older, or I know I have a disability, I'm starting to lose my balance a little bit. So they can put on a little bar in the tub area so I can grab onto and not lose my balance. So that's like an example of an accommodation. Here, remember I mentioned the headsets for some people that might be an accommodation. They have those available when we go to the movie theater and some events. Now, when it comes to alterations for some of these buildings, it may be costly, but I've seen recently how they've eliminated a part of the park to make more accessible parking available for people that need it. So there's all these regulations that oftentimes if people advocate, they need to comply. Okay, so I mentioned telecommunications. There's a lot of services available now that makes it that much easier to access. Let's see. In 2008, there was an amendment made to make adjustments to the term of the definition of disability, so it became broader. They cover more things. And here's a list of resources for you. I'm coming close to the end of my presentation here. So there's all these, the Department of, all these, links that are available for you to access, whether it's for education, transportation, communication, employment, right? And access to healthcare. A lot of doctors too have to comply in making their doctor's appointments accessible to some of our peers, and also speak the language and be culturally competent to be able to serve us, right? Also, these other resources from the Access Board, it relates to communications. Now, ADA, there's other fact sheets that can help you understand more about the ADA and your personal rights. Remember, I shared also some of the individuals that may have HIV or AIDS are eligible for some ADA protections, and there's some information on that. And here's the other resource on health as well. So should you have any questions, you feel free to always reach our agency. We're available during the day, Monday through Friday, 9 to 4. Everybody's working from home to make sure we're following all the health guidelines. The number to call is a 1-800-776-5746. And for TTY, there's 1-800-719-5798. And for any other resources that you're welcome to reach out to our website, the disabilityrightsca.org. Now I'm open for questions. I want to thank you for your attention and listening to me.